They died for each other before they ever admitted they were alive for each other. And the secret they buried in the dark, it refused to stay buried. We are starting the story now. The lift arrived on the 4th floor with a sound like a held breath released. A soft, pressurized exhale of iron and magic that Hermione had stopped noticing sometime in October. She stepped out without looking up from the parchment in her hands, already moving through the corridor with the particular efficiency of someone who had memorized every stone, every sconce, every drafty alcove where the torches guttered for no reason anyone had ever adequately explained. The Department of Magical Reconciliation occupied a wing of the ministry that felt perpetually like a room someone had just left. The air held the specific quality of interrupted occupation. Quills set down mid-sentence, tea cooling in mugs, chairs pushed back at angles that suggested haste. Every morning, Hermione arrived to find her desk exactly as she had left it, yet somehow arranged as though she were expected rather than returning. She told herself it was the nature of the work. Reconciliation was, after all, the business of aftermath. She did not examine the thought too closely. Her desk sat in the far corner, beneath a window that faced the interior atrium rather than the outside world. Because there was no outside world here. Not really. Only the vast engineered sky of the ministry's upper chambers, perpetually overcast with a light that was neither morning nor afternoon, but something suspended between the two. On her desk, 3 open case files, a pot of ink with a crack along its base that never seemed to leak, and a small framed photograph of her parents that she had placed there on her first day, and which she now rarely looked at directly. She was reading case notes on a mediation between 2 former Azkaban families when she heard him. Not his voice. Draco Malfoy rarely announced himself with something as direct as speech. It was the sound he made entering a room, that particular quality of displaced air, of atmosphere rearranging itself around someone who moved as though he'd rather not be noticed and had never quite succeeded. Hermione had developed an involuntary awareness of it over 3 months of shared office space. She suspected and resented that her nervous system had begun cataloguing him. "The Flint mediation file," he said, not quite to her. "Have you moved it?" "It's on the 3rd shelf." She did not look up. Behind the Selwyn correspondence. A pause. The particular pause that meant he'd found it immediately and was deciding whether to acknowledge this. "It wasn't there yesterday." "It was," she said. "You were looking at the wrong shelf." Another pause. Longer. She heard the soft resistance of parchment being lifted, smoothed. Then the sound of him settling at his own desk, which faced hers at an angle, neither directly opposite nor politely averted, but somewhere in the geometry of careful neutrality. Hermione finally looked up. He was reading the file with the focused stillness he brought to everything, one hand flat on the desk, the other turning pages with a deliberateness that seemed designed to suggest he was entirely unaware of being observed. His hair had grown slightly since September, still pale, still ruthlessly kept, and he was wearing the charcoal robes that she had privately decided suited him better than the formal black ones he'd worn in their first weeks. He looked, she thought, like someone who had learned to inhabit professional spaces the way a person learns to inhabit a language that is not their mother tongue. Correctly, fluently, and with a faint, persistent sense of translation. He glanced up. She looked back at her parchment. "The Flint case," she said, to have said something. "Mediation is on Thursday. I know when it is. I thought we might prepare jointly this time, given the last session." A beat of silence with texture to it, not empty, but freighted, the way a corridor feels freighted when two people pass too close. "The last session was fine," he said. "Peregrine Flint through an inkwell? At the wall, not at either of us. Draco." He looked up again at the sound of his name in her mouth, and something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, not quite its opposite. They had been using first names for approximately 6 weeks, the shift so gradual that neither had marked the exact moment of change, which was, Hermione sometimes thought, precisely how the most significant things happened. Not announced, just suddenly, irrevocably, present. "Fine," he said. "Joint preparation. Tomorrow morning." She nodded and returned to her notes. But for a moment, just a moment, she was aware of the room with unusual sharpness. The cold in the stones behind her, the quality of the light, the sound of his breathing, slow and even several feet away. The sensation of having forgotten something important. Not a thing she'd meant to bring, but something she'd always carried, now inexplicably absent. She pressed her fingers flat against her desk. The grain of the wood was cool and very particular. She focused on it until the feeling passed. It always passed. The ministry canteen at 1:30 was loud in the way that institutional spaces are loud. Not joyful noise, but functional noise. The sound of many people eating quickly because the afternoon waited. Hermione carried her tray to a table near the east wall and sat, opening the mediation notes she'd brought, because eating alone without reading made her feel the silence too acutely. She was 3 paragraphs into the Flint family's post-war asset claims when she noticed that the 2 witches at the next table, both from magical law enforcement, she thought, though she couldn't place their names, had not glanced at her once. Not in the way of pointedly ignoring her, which she knew well and could read in a moment, but in the way of not seeing her, the way you don't see the torches in a familiar corridor because they are simply part of the world you move through. She stirred her soup. She watched the room. It happened, she realized, fairly often. Not always. There were days when colleagues stopped her in the corridor, when Robards called her into meetings, when the ordinary friction of institutional life pressed reassuringly against her. But there were other days. Days when she seemed to move through the ministry like a word mispronounced so long that everyone had quietly agreed to stop correcting it. Draco appeared with a tray and sat across from her without asking. This, too, had evolved without discussion. They did not eat lunch together. They simply ate lunch, and increasingly they did so in the same vicinity, which was a distinction that Hermione maintained carefully in her own mind and suspected he did too. "You're doing it again," he said. She looked at him. "Doing what?" "Watching the room like you're conducting a census." He picked up his fork. "You have a very specific expression. You look like something is failing to add up." "That's just my face." "No," he said, with the certainty of someone who had spent considerable time studying the thing he was discussing. "It's not." Hermione set down her spoon. "Did anyone stop you on the way in? Speak to you, I mean, not just move around you." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of not knowing, but the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer honestly. "Thomas from Records," he said finally. But he was looking for a file. He stopped. Barely what? He looked at me like he was trying to place me. He said it as though the words tasted of something he'd rather not identify. Like he knew my name, but couldn't quite locate why. Hermione looked at her soup. "It's been happening for weeks, to me." "I know. You've noticed." "Of course I've noticed." He said it with the particular precision of someone who notices everything and speaks of very little. "I assumed you'd reach a threshold and bring it up. You generally do." She felt, briefly, the strange warmth of being known, of having a habit identified and spoken without mockery, simply as a fact about her, as reliable as the crack in the inkwell that never leaked. She filed the feeling away from scrutiny. "What do you think it is?" she asked. He cut something on his plate with more attention than it required. "Residual war strangeness," he said. "Half the ministry is still reorienting. People forget who belongs in what rooms." His voice was steady. His jaw was not quite. "It will settle." Hermione looked at him for a long moment, at the careful evenness of his expression, at the almost imperceptible tension along the line of his collarbone where his robe sat. "You don't believe that," she said quietly. He looked up. Their eyes held for a breath that neither of them counted. "No," he said. "I don't." She worked late, which she always did, partly from habit and partly because the department in the evening had a quality she found unexpectedly easier than its daytime self. Emptier, stiller, with the torchlight gone amber, and the parchment and copper smell of the office more concentrated, more honest. She worked best when the institutional performance of the day had ceased, and only the actual work remained. She was alone, she thought. Then she heard the specific quality of his silence and understood she was not. Draco stood at the window, the atrium window that faced the internal sky, with his arms crossed and his back to the room. He was not working. He was simply standing, which was something she had seen him do before, though never quite like this. Not with that particular set to his shoulders, that angle of his head, as though he were listening for something beyond the register of ordinary hearing. She should have made a sound, cleared her throat, shuffled parchment, let him know she was there, and reorient them both toward the safe territory of professionalism. She didn't. She watched him stand at the window in the amber light, and something ached in her chest, with an ache she couldn't locate precisely. Not sorrow, not longing as she conventionally understood it, but something older, something that felt disconcertingly like recognition. He turned before she expected him to, and for a half-second his face was unguarded, pale and still, and holding an expression she had no ready name for, except that it looked, somehow, like grief that had learned to hold very quiet. Then he saw her, and the surface settled. "I thought you'd gone," he said. "I was going to." A pause. He looked back at the window. "The atrium lights changed," he said. "About an hour ago. They went darker, not dimmer. Darker, a different quality." Hermione frowned and looked. He was right, though she hadn't consciously registered it. The light in the atrium had taken on a different character, deeper, more interior, as though the source had moved somewhere further inside the architecture. "I'll mention it to facilities," she said. "I mentioned it to facilities," he said, "in September." She was quiet. They didn't remember the conversation, he added very evenly. The next day, the witch I spoke to had no recollection of it. The ache in her chest shifted, pressed into something sharper. She rose from her desk and came to stand beside him at the window. Not close, but closer than desk distance. The social calculus of proximity redrawn by the lateness of the hour and the amber of the light, and the fact that they were, in this moment, the only two people left on the 4th floor. "Draco," she said, not to start a sentence, just to say it. He didn't look at her, but something in the set of his shoulders changed. A minutely perceptible release, a degree of tension surrendered like a word finally pronounced. "There's something wrong," she said, "with this floor, with the way people see us, with—" She stopped, pressed her fingers against her sternum once, quickly, as though marking a location. "Something is wrong, and I don't know how to investigate it, because every time I try to pull at the thread isn't there." He was quiet for a long time. "I know," he said finally. "What do we do?" He turned to look at her then, full on, without the sideways quality that characterized most of their direct interactions, with his grey eyes catching the deepened light and holding it the way cold water holds cold, entirely, right through. "We find the thread," he said, "and we pull anyway." She held his gaze. The atrium light pressed between them, amber dark and strangely warm. Somewhere below, an owl passed through the central chamber, and its wing beats echoed upward, the sound spreading and diminishing like a stone dropped in still water. She thought, for a reason she could not explain. "I have heard that sound before. Exactly that sound, in exactly this quality of light." The thought left before she could examine it. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. And neither of them moved from the window for quite some time. The records room on the 4th floor existed in a state of organized neglect. Shelves that reached the vaulted ceiling, file boxes stacked with the particular density of things that had been accumulating longer than anyone currently employed could account for, and an atmospheric pressure that was somehow distinct from the rest of the ministry, thicker and more deliberate, the way the air inside a very old church feels different from the air immediately outside its doors. Hermione had requested access to the wartime emergency spell registry at 7:43 in the morning. By 8:15, she had received confirmation from the registry office that no such records existed on the 4th floor. By 8:19, she had found them herself, 3rd shelf from the bottom, in a box labelled with a date that corresponded to the final months of the war. She did not examine how she had known where to look. The files were written in the compressed administrative shorthand of wartime documentation, spells recorded by effect rather than by name, casters identified by department rather than individual. The whole archive constructed with a bureaucratic instinct for accountability without specificity that characterized ministry record-keeping at its most defensive. She spread 3 folders across the reading table and began working through them with the systematic focus that was her default mode when the alternative was feeling something she hadn't yet categorized. Draco arrived at 8:43, which she knew without looking up because the air in the records room changed when he entered. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have defended with evidence, but perceptibly, the way a room's acoustic character shifts when a second person occupies it. "You started without me," he said. "I said tomorrow morning. It is tomorrow morning. I thought that was a loose arrangement. I don't make loose arrangements." He pulled the chair across from hers and sat, reaching for the nearest folder with the unhurried competence she had come to associate with him specifically, the movement of someone who had learned to perform capability so consistently that it had become genuine. She watched him read for a moment, the line between his brows when he concentrated, the way his thumb moved along the edge of the parchment, as though reading by touch as well as sight. She looked back at her own file. "The Wartime Emergency Registry," he said. "Smart. If something significant happened on this floor during the war, something involving an unregistered spell, there would be a trace of it here, an anomaly in the record, something filed under effect without a corresponding cause." And she turned the folder toward him and pointed. The entry was brief. 2 lines of the compressed wartime shorthand dated the 2nd of May, the final night of the Battle of Hogwarts. The effect was recorded as unauthorized binding, dual anchor, cause undetermined. The location was listed simply as Ministry adjacent, unspecified interior. The casters were listed as unidentified. 2 subjects, status unconfirmed. Draco read it twice. She watched his face perform its careful stillness. "Unconfirmed status," he said, which in wartime shorthand means presumed casualties. He set the folder down. "That's what it means. The registry didn't confirm them as survivors." The word casualties landed in the space between them with a weight that seemed disproportionate to its syllables. Hermione was very conscious of the table's surface under her fingertips, the grain of old wood, slightly rough, very real. "We're not casualties," she said. Her voice came out even. "No," he agreed. But he was looking at the entry again, and his thumb had stilled against the parchment edge. "A dual anchor binding," she said, because working through the logic was easier than sitting in the silence the entry had created. "That's an extraordinarily complex piece of magic. I've read about the theoretical framework. It was considered experimental even before the war. 2 casters, 2 anchors, a single redirected outcome." She paused. "To perform that wandlessly, wordlessly, under combat conditions would be nearly impossible," he said. "Yes, and yet, and yet." They looked at each other across the table. The records room pressed around them, heavy with its accumulated paperweight of history, the shelves leaning faintly inward as old shelves do, the single torch in the corner burning with a steadiness that seemed mildly implausible given the draught from the door. "I don't remember it," Hermione said carefully. "Neither do I. A beat. But. The words sat between them, small and precisely shaped, holding the weight of what neither of them was yet prepared to follow it with. Hermione gathered the files with hands that moved with somewhat more purpose than was strictly necessary, straightening the edges twice. "There are 2 more registry boxes from that date. I want to cross-reference the location records, if we can narrow down where on the 4th floor." "Granger." She stopped. He said her name rarely. When he did, it had a quality distinct from his other speech. Slightly lower, the consonants more deliberate, as though the word required more care than ordinary words. She had begun noticing this approximately 4 weeks ago, and wished she hadn't. We should consider the possibility, he said, that the reason we're looking for this information is because some part of us already has it. She held the stack of folders against her chest. The parchment was cool through her robes. That's not a productive framework. It's not meant to be productive. It's meant to be accurate. She held his gaze for a moment. His expression was the careful one, the level grey of it, the deliberate composure. But underneath the composure, visible the way deep water is visible through clear ice, was something that looked very much like the specific fear of someone who has already begun to suspect the answer. "Let me finish the cross-reference," she said. "Then we'll talk about frameworks." She found it at 11 o'clock, and she knew it was the right entry because her hands went cold before she had finished reading it. The location record was filed under structural anomalies, post-battle assessment, and described a sealed room on the 4th floor, sealed not by lock or ward, but by what the assessor had recorded as spontaneous magical closure, unknown cause, recommend review. The review had apparently never occurred. The room was listed by coordinates rather than name, which Hermione converted with 3 minutes of careful arithmetic. She stood in the corridor outside the records room and looked at the wall 30 feet ahead of her. There was no door there. There was no break in the stone, no frame, no handle, no gap. Only the familiar corridor with its evenly spaced torches and its smooth, uninterrupted wall, exactly as it had always been for 3 months of her daily passage through this space. She stood very still and looked at the wall. And then, with the particular quality of a thing remembered rather than perceived for the first time, she saw it. Not a door, but the ghost of a door. The spatial suggestion of an opening, visible in the right light, the way certain letters are visible on very old parchment when held at an angle. The faintest rectangular seam in the stone, the almost imperceptible difference in texture that marked a threshold. She heard footsteps behind her and did not turn. "You found the coordinates," Draco said. "There's a room," she said, "behind that wall." He came to stand beside her. Not behind, not at a professional remove, but beside, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against her left arm without any actual contact. He looked at the wall the way she was looking at it. "I know," he said quietly. She turned her head to look at him. He was already looking at her. "You've been here before," she said. It was not quite a question. "I think," he said, with the slow care of someone choosing each word the way you choose footing on uncertain ground, "that I've been here before in the same way that you've been here before, which is to say, not consciously. Not consciously." The torch nearest the wall guttered once, throwing their shadows long and then short against the stone. In the half-second of that disruption, Hermione could have sworn the seam in the wall deepened, became more visible, more present, as though the room behind it had shifted slightly toward wakefulness. "Why does it feel," she said very quietly, "like it's been waiting?" He didn't answer immediately. His jaw moved once, a tiny involuntary motion, the kind that precedes a sentence that takes courage to begin. "Because I think it has," he said. She thought about him on the way home. She had developed, over the course of her adult life, a rigorous system for categorizing the thoughts she allowed herself, and within that system, she had created a particular subdirectory, unlabeled but precisely located, for thoughts about Draco Malfoy that didn't fit neatly elsewhere. He was difficult to think about tidily. This was itself the problem. She could manage him in professional terms without difficulty. His competence was not in question. His commitment to the work was increasingly evident, and the particular intelligence he brought to mediation cases was the kind she genuinely respected. Precise, lateral, unpredictable in its connections. Working with him was interesting in the specific way that made hours contract and case notes sprawl far beyond their original scope. That was fine. She could hold that clearly. What she could not hold clearly was the accumulation of smaller things. The way he had said, pull anyway with that quality of decided weight, as though the decision had cost something, and he'd made it regardless. The particular care with which he said her name. The image of him at the window in the amber light with grief written quietly across his face. The way, this morning in the corridor before the sealed wall, he had stood close enough that she could have turned slightly, and the space between them would have disappeared entirely, and neither of them had moved, and neither of them had remarked upon not moving. She pressed the thought flat. There was a sealed room on the 4th floor. There was a registry entry describing an unconfirmed dual anchor binding from the night she had thought was only a night of survival. There was a wrongness in the ministry that had been accumulating for 3 months. And it was centered, she was almost certain now, on their floor, their wing, themselves. These were the things that required her attention. Not the way he looked at her sometimes, in the instant before he corrected his expression. Not the warmth of him beside her in the corridor. Not the unlabeled subdirectory growing quietly fuller. She made tea when she got home. She stood in her kitchen and watched the steam rise from the cup and thought about dual anchor magic and the theory of spontaneous spatial closure and the administrative shorthand of the wartime registry. She thought, status, unconfirmed. She thought, 2 subjects. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum, the same gesture she had made at the window the previous evening, marking a location, a site of something that was not quite pain. Under her palm, her heartbeat was steady and very present and completely real. She thought, then why does it feel like an echo? She stood in her kitchen until the tea went cold, and the thought did not resolve, only deepened, the way water deepens when you move from the shallows without noticing the moment the ground stopped being beneath your feet. The door appeared on a Wednesday, not dramatically, not with the theatrical flourish of magic announcing itself, no shimmer of revealed enchantment, no sound of ancient locks disengaging. It was simply there when Hermione turned the corridor corner at 7:58 in the morning, as though it had always been there, and she had simply lacked the correct quality of attention to perceive it. An arched wooden door, dark with age, set into the stone wall at the precise coordinates she had calculated from the location records. Iron handle, no visible lock. The wood surface carrying the particular texture of something that had absorbed decades of ambient magic, the way old timber absorbs weather, deeply, without resistance, until the thing and the thing it had absorbed became indistinguishable. She stopped walking. The corridor was empty. The nearest torch burned with its usual steadiness. Somewhere below, the ministry was conducting its mourning. The distant percussion of the atrium, the muffled transit of the lifts, the ordinary institutional sounds of a building populated by hundreds of people who had not once, in 3 months, looked at her with quite the right quality of recognition. She looked at the door. The door, in the manner of very old and very particular things, looked back. She did not touch the handle. She stood at a distance of perhaps 4 feet and examined it the way she examined everything that required understanding, with the full weight of her attention, cataloguing detail, looking for the seam between what the thing appeared to be and what it actually was. The wood had a grain that ran slightly contrary to its apparent age. The iron of the handle was not oxidized in the pattern consistent with decades of neglect, but in the pattern of something that had been handled recently and often, the wear concentrated at the grip point with the specificity of repeated use. Someone had been here. The thought arrived with a certainty she couldn't source. She heard him at the corridor's end before she saw him. The particular rhythm of his footsteps, which she had catalogued without meaning to, and could now identify with an accuracy that slightly disturbed her. Draco rounded the corner and stopped, as she had stopped when he saw the door. Then he looked at her. "When?" he said. "It was here when I arrived." He crossed the distance to her with a purposefulness that bypassed his usual considered movement, coming to stand at her shoulder, slightly behind, slightly to her left, and looking at the door with an expression she could read more easily now than she'd been able to 3 months ago. Not quite recognition, something anterior to recognition. The look of a person approaching a word that has been on the tip of their tongue for so long, the frustration has quieted into a kind of strained, exhausted waiting. "The handle," he said. "Worn at the grip. Recent use." "Not recent," he said. His voice was very level. "Repeated." She turned her head slightly toward him. "You've touched it." It was not an accusation. His jaw moved in the way it moved when he was working through honesty as a deliberate act rather than a reflex. "I don't remember touching it," he said, "but I know exactly how it feels under my hand." He looked at her then, with grey eyes carrying the specific weight of something that has been examined alone and found too heavy to continue examining alone. The iron is cold, even when the corridor is warm. The latch requires pressure at a particular angle, slightly downward, then toward you. The door doesn't creak. It opens on a breath. Hermione's chest did something complicated and quiet. She turned back to the door. "Then open it," she said. The room beyond was not large. This was the first thing she registered. Not its contents, not its atmosphere, but its scale. She had expected, without knowing she'd expected it, something vast. A chamber proportionate to the weight the sealed door had carried in her thoughts. Instead, it was a room of perhaps 5 meters by 4, with a low ceiling and walls of unfinished stone, and the quality of air that belongs to spaces that have been closed for a long time. Not stale exactly, but settled, the air having reached an equilibrium with its container and ceased to move. There was a table, 2 chairs facing each other across it, positioned with a particularity that suggested deliberate arrangement rather than incidental placement. The angle of each chair to the table, the precise distance between them, as though whoever had placed them had been thinking not of furniture, but of a conversation. On the table, a single candle, unlit in a plain brass holder, and beside the candle, a piece of parchment. Hermione crossed to the table. The stone floor was uneven beneath her feet, in a pattern her feet seemed to anticipate without instruction, weight shifting automatically over the rough places. She reached the table and looked at the parchment without touching it. It was not a document, not a spell record or a registry entry or anything administrative. It was a page of handwriting. Two distinct hands, she could see immediately, each writing not alongside the other, but in response, the lines alternating with the call and answer quality of a recorded conversation. Her handwriting and his. The thought arrived from a very great distance and landed with a weight that had no corresponding sound. She heard Draco's breath change behind her, a single, short disruption of its usual evenness, quickly controlled. He came to stand at her side and looked at the parchment. "That's," he began. "Yes." They read it together in silence. The handwriting on the page was unambiguously theirs. Hermione's compressed and precise, his slanted and spaced with the particular spacing of someone who'd been taught penmanship by someone who considered it a moral matter. But the words on the page were words neither of them could remember writing. The conversation recorded there was of people speaking with a directness and a lack of defensive architecture that felt simultaneously foreign and entirely achingly familiar. Her hand on the page. "I don't know how much time we have." His hand below it. "Enough." Her hand. "That isn't an answer." His hand. "It's the only answer that matters right now." Her hand. "If this doesn't work." His hand. "Don't." Her hand. "Draco." His hand. I know. Don't say it." A space on the page. A gap between entries that felt less like a pause in writing and more like a pause in speech. The gap of a moment that hadn't needed words, that had existed in some register beyond them. Then her hand again, at a slightly different angle, the pressure of the quill lighter. "Will you remember this?" And his, directly below, the ink slightly heavier, as though the pen had been pressed with more force than usual. "I'll remember everything." Hermione's hand, her actual present hand, rose to her collarbone and pressed there, flat-palmed, as though to confirm the solidity of herself. The gesture had become involuntary over recent weeks. She was only now consciously aware of it. Beside her, Draco was very still. "We were here," he said. The sentence had no inflection, not a question, not a conclusion, but the verbal equivalent of setting something down carefully. "During the battle," she said, "or near the end of it. The registry entry was dated the 2nd of May. We performed the binding here. I think the room was already here. I think..." She stopped, working through it. "I think it drew us. Or we drew each other here. Either way, this was where it happened." He pulled out one of the chairs and sat, not with his usual deliberateness, but with something that looked like the involuntary sit of someone whose legs have decided, independent of intention. He looked at the parchment on the table. She stood across from him and watched his face move through something private and complicated and not entirely resolved. "A dual anchor binding," he said finally. "The magic requires both casters to offer something genuine. It can't be performed on calculation. The theoretical framework, you mentioned it." He looked up at her. "What does the theory say about the anchor itself? What each caster provides?" She sat in the other chair. The seat was exactly the right height, the angle exactly the right angle. Her spine settled against the back of it with the ease of something returning. The anchor, she said carefully, is the most contested element of the theory, because it can't be a decision. It can't be a strategic offering. The magic reads intent at a level beneath volition. She paused. The anchor has to be something true. The word true sat in the room's still air and did not dissipate. Draco looked at the parchment again, at the line that said, "I'll remember everything." His thumb moved against the table's edge, the same gesture she'd observed in the records room, that slow movement along a surface as though reading it. "Something true," he said quietly, "between two people who had every reason to be each other's enemies." Yes, who had been, in fact, each other's enemies for the better part of 6 years. Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. The unlit candle on the table caught a thread of light from the doorway they'd left open behind them, its wax surface gleaming faintly. "I don't remember what it was," he said. "What I offered. What was true enough." His voice carried no drama, which made it harder to listen to, not easier. "I'd like to think I could identify it by logic, work backwards from the effect to the cause. But the truth is that anything I could arrive at by logic probably wouldn't qualify." Hermione looked at him across the table. Across the parchment with their recorded words, the conversation neither of them could remember having in a room neither of them had consciously known they'd been in. "Neither would mine," she said. "And I'm very good at logic." Something moved in his expression, a loosening, almost involuntary, like a word released that had been held for too long. "I know you are," he said. The candle on the table lit, not from any visible source, no match, no spell, no draft of triggered magic. Simply lit, the flame appearing with the quiet certainty of something that had decided the moment had arrived, burning straight and without flicker in the room's utterly still air. They both looked at it. "The binding," Hermione said, in a voice she was keeping very steady through an act of deliberate will, "is still active, 3 months after the war, in a sealed room that has apparently been waiting." "Yes." "And we are the anchors." "Yes." "Which means," she said, "that whatever we each offered, whatever was true enough, it hasn't resolved. The magic is still holding because the condition hasn't been fulfilled." He met her eyes across the candle's small, certain flame. His face in that light had lost its careful surface and become something less defended. Not naked, not exposed, but present in a way that the professional composure of their daily interactions allowed only in edges and glimpses. "What condition?" he asked, though his voice suggested he was beginning to understand. Hermione pressed her hand flat against the table surface, feeling the grain of it, the reality of it, the grounding specificity of old wood and present moment. "The thing that was true," she said, "is still true. The magic knows it." She exhaled slowly. "The binding won't release until we do." The flame burned straight between them. Outside, in the corridor, a torch guttered and went out. Then, after a moment, quietly reignited, as though the building itself had taken a breath and decided to continue. Memory, Hermione had learned during her years of academic study, was not a recording. It was a reconstruction, a process of retrieval that rebuilt the past from available materials each time it was accessed, which meant each recollection was slightly different from the last, shaped by the present moment's mood and need. and fear. Memory was not a fixed text, but a living document, perpetually revised. She had found this deeply unsettling as a student. She found it considerably more unsettling now. The memory arrived on Thursday evening, between her third and fourth case note of the Flint mediation preparation, without warning or precedent. Not gradually, not in fragments, but whole, the way a door opens onto a room that has been waiting entirely furnished behind it. She was sitting at her desk. She was holding a quill. The ink at its tip was beginning to dry. And then she was not at her desk. The corridor on the fourth floor of the ministry, the 2nd of May, 2:30 in the morning. Not the corridor as it was now, amber-lit, organized, professionally swept, but the corridor as it had been then, with smoke still finding its way through the ventilation shafts from the battle above. One torch blown out entirely, the emergency ward lighting throwing everything in a blue-white that made the stone walls look underwater. She was running. She had been running for 6 hours, and her lungs had stopped registering the effort, operating now on some mechanical level beneath exhaustion. In her left hand, a wand that was not her own. She had lost hers in the East Wing an hour ago, in the confusion near the Aura offices. In her right hand, nothing. She needed both hands for the counter-curse she was trying to hold active around the unconscious figure of Dean Thomas, whom she was somehow also half carrying, his weight distributed across her right shoulder in a way that was going to leave bruising for 2 weeks. She heard the hex before she saw it. The sound of that particular curse. She would know it anywhere, had known it since her 3rd year, had spent years afterward trying to unknow it. Was not a crack or a bang, but a frequency, a vibration in the air itself, something the body registered before the ears did. She felt it in the back of her teeth. She turned. The corridor intersected ahead of her at a T-junction, and from the left branch came the Death Eater. She did not know him, could not place him, registered only the mask and the extended wand arm and the green light already assembled and beginning its terrible forward motion. She was too slow. She knew she was too slow in the same absolute mathematical way you know a step will find no ground in the instant before the fall. She had Dean's weight on her right side, the unfamiliar wand in her wrong hand, and she had turned too late. The geometry was not in her favour. From the right branch of the junction, a figure, grey eyes and pale hair and robes that had been black at the start of the night and were now the colour of everything that had happened to him, dark and torn and carrying the evidence of hours she hadn't been present for and couldn't read. Draco Malfoy. He had approximately 2 seconds. She would think about those 2 seconds for the rest of her life, the rest of her first life, the one that ended in this corridor, and she would never fully resolve what she made of them. What she saw in his face in those 2 seconds was not heroism, which would have been the clean version, the readable version. What she saw was something faster and more fundamental than any decision. The absolute absence of hesitation, which is not the same thing as certainty, but is sometimes indistinguishable from it. He stepped in front of her, not beside, not at an angle that distributed the risk. In front, squarely, with his back to her and his wand raised, and the particular deliberateness of someone who has selected a position and intends to hold it. What happened next was something Hermione's analytical mind had attempted to reconstruct many times in the hours and days that followed, in the first version of her life where she had survived cleanly and Draco had. But that version had not happened either, had it? What happened next was this. He raised his wand and she raised hers, and the magic that emerged was not from either of them individually, but from the space between them, from some circuit completed by proximity and crisis, and the specific truth of that particular moment between those particular two people. The dual anchor binding, unauthorized, unrecorded in any spell text she had read before or since, born not from knowledge, but from something the magic found in both of them simultaneously and used without asking. The green light stopped, not deflected, stopped. Suspended in the air 3 feet from Draco's chest, a terrible frozen star held in place by a force that came from somewhere Hermione could feel behind her sternum, pulling from her like light from a lamp that has been asked to illuminate more than its designed radius. She felt herself dimming. She felt him dimming too. Knew it the way you know things in dreams, directly, without the usual mediating distance of evidence. Then the suspended curse dissolved, not with a sound, with a silence, the specific silence of something unmaking itself, returning to the potential it had come from. And then the corridor, and the blue-white light, and Dean's weight on her shoulder, and Draco turning to look at her with an expression she had no architecture to receive at the time, which was perhaps why it had taken this long to return. He had looked at her the way you look at something you have just realized you would not have wanted to exist in a world without. She had not known what to do with that, so she had done nothing. She had said, "Can you take him?" meaning Dean, and he had, wordlessly, shifted Dean's weight from her shoulder to his own, and they had moved through the rest of that night side by side without speaking of what had happened. And by morning the war had ended, and the corridor had been sealed, and the memory had gone somewhere she couldn't access. Until now. The quill dropped from her hand. She heard it hit the desk from a very great distance. The office around her resolved gradually. The amber light, the familiar disorder of her case files, the window facing the interior atrium. Her hands, she noticed, were not shaking. They were very still, which somehow required more effort. She heard his footsteps in the corridor and looked up. Draco came through the office doorway and stopped when he saw her face. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading her expression with the directness he permitted himself when the content of what he found there was too significant for peripheral attention. "You remember," he said. It was not a question. His voice was very quiet and entirely level, the specific tone he used when the alternative was something he was not prepared to be visible. "The corridor," she said. "The junction. Dean." He crossed the room and sat in his chair, not with his usual precision, but with a movement that had something surrendered in it, the posture of someone setting down a weight they've been carrying at an angle that was never quite right. "When did it come back to you?" she asked. "This morning." He looked at his hands on the desk. "I was reviewing the Selwyn file, and then I wasn't. I was in the corridor." He paused. "I came in at 10:30. You were already here. You were working. I decided to—" He stopped. "You decided not to tell me immediately." "I decided to verify that I hadn't simply—" He made a slight movement with his hand, dismissive and also not. constructed it, filled in a gap with something convenient. And the details are too specific for construction. His jaw was set in the line she associated with truths he'd chosen to stop resisting. The torch that was out, Dean's specific weight and angle, the sound of that hex. I've been hearing it intermittently for 3 months and not knowing what I was hearing. Hermione looked at him, at the careful surface of him, and beneath it, visible now, made visible by the memory they had both just returned from. The shape of what it had cost him to carry this without a name. "You stepped in front of me," she said. His eyes came to hers. "Yes." Without hesitation. "Yes." A pause. "Don't make it more than it was." "I'm not making it anything." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm saying what happened. People do things in battle that don't represent." He stopped himself. A small, precise stop, the verbal equivalent of a hand pressed flat against a surface to feel what it's made of. "I don't want you to draw conclusions that—" "Draco." She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, with weight, without softness exactly, but with a kind of directness that did not permit him to deflect behind it. The binding required something true, from both of us. That is what the theory says, and that is what we agreed. I know what the theory says. So, whatever you offered, whatever the magic found in you in that moment, it wasn't a battle reflex. She paused. Battle reflexes don't power unauthorized experimental magic. He was very still. The kind of still that preceded either speech or departure. She waited because she had learned that with him, the quality of the waiting determined which one followed. "I was following you for the last 20 minutes of that corridor," he said finally. His voice had the particular quietness of something spoken carefully into a fragile medium. I wasn't tracking you intentionally. I came around a corner and saw you with Dean, and I stayed at a distance because I didn't know." He paused. "I didn't know if you'd accept help from me. That night of all nights, with everything that—" He left the sentence open. Everything that he had been. Everything she'd had reason to refuse him. "But you stayed close," she said. "I stayed close." He looked at her directly. "And when I saw the hex, I didn't think. There was genuinely no thought. There was only the absolute—" He stopped again, and this time the stop had a different quality, as though he'd arrived at a word and found it larger than he'd expected. "The absolute what?" she asked, very quietly. The office was still around them. The amber light sat warmly on his shoulders, on the angles of his face, on the careful, composed surface that had, in this conversation, developed the hairline fractures of a thing under honest pressure. "Unacceptability," he said. "Of the alternative." The word arrived in the room and stayed. Hermione felt it against her sternum. Not the pressing gesture she made with her own hand, but the word itself, landing there with the specific weight of something that had been true for a long time and had simply required the right moment to be spoken. "That's what the magic found," she said. "Yes." His voice was almost inaudible. "I imagine so." She looked at him for a long moment, at the pale steadiness of him in the amber light, at the grey of his eyes which held in this moment no defensive surface at all, but only the thing itself. The truth the binding had been made from, sitting there quietly, having waited 3 months and however many years before that to be in a room with sufficient honesty to breathe. She thought of her own anchor, the thing the magic had found in her. She was not yet ready to say it, but she felt it with a completeness that left very little room for the careful management of conclusions she'd been practicing since September. "We need to go back to the room," she said. "I know. Tomorrow." He nodded once. Then, because the conversation had reached its limit, had said what it could bear to say in a single evening, and needed the night between them and whatever came next, he looked back at his desk and picked up the Selwyn file. She picked up her quill. They worked in silence for another hour, side by side in the amber light, the space between their desks charged with everything that had been said, and the considerably larger mass of what hadn't been yet, pressing outward from the inside like light behind glass, looking for the crack wide enough to come through. The room was different in the morning. Not structurally. The table remained, the two chairs, the brass candle holder with its remnant of yesterday's wax, pooled and resolidified into a new shape. But the quality of the air had changed. The settled equilibrium of a sealed space, disturbed now by their repeated entry, as though the room had been asked a question and was in the process of formulating its answer. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower, not oppressively, rather with the intimacy of a space that had decided to become proportionate to its occupants. Hermione set her notes on the table and did not sit immediately. She stood at the room's center and turned slowly, examining it with the deliberate attention she'd been unable to fully apply yesterday, when the parchment with their handwriting had consumed everything. The walls, on closer inspection, were not entirely bare. Near the floor on the eastern side, barely visible in the light from the corridor they'd left the door open to, was a series of marks in the stone. She crossed to them and crouched. Not words, not a spell notation. Tallies, the kind made by someone keeping count. Grouped in fives, scratched with what might have been a wand tip or a coin edge, the marks shallow but deliberate. She counted 43. 43 what? She said. Not a question directed at him exactly, but she heard him cross the room and crouch beside her. His shoulder was 3 inches from hers. The warmth of him in the cool room was very specific. Days, he said. She turned her head. He was looking at the marks with a recognition she was beginning to identify as distinct from ordinary memory. Not recall, but something more like a tuning fork responding to a frequency that had never stopped being played. "You made these," she said. "We both did." He pointed without touching. The groupings changed style partway through. "Here, that's mine. The spacing. From here." His finger moved along the wall, not quite touching the stone. "That's yours. Tighter. More even." She looked at the shift he indicated. He was right. The marks from roughly the 20th tally onward had her particular quality of precision. The same compression she brought to her handwriting, to her note-taking, to everything she did where neatness was a form of control over materials that might otherwise feel unmanageable. "We were here for 43 days, she said. "During and after the battle." She stood slowly, looking at the tallies from standing height. Or 43 visits, or 43. 43 conversations, he said. He stood beside her. The word conversations sat in the room with a specific gravity, and Hermione thought of the parchment, the alternating hands, the call and response of it, the intimacy of 2 people who had found in this room something they could not find in the corridor or the office or the ordinary daylit spaces of their lives. "We kept coming back," she said. "Yes. After the battle, in the days that followed, while the ministry was being reconstructed. She was working through it, not to share the process, but because working through it was how she stayed present inside information that wanted to destabilize her. "We kept coming back to this room, and talking," he said. "I think we were simply talking. The simplicity of it, the devastating plainness of it. Two people in the wreckage of everything they'd known, finding a sealed room and returning to it 43 times because it was the one place where the conversation could be honest." She moved to the table and sat in her chair. Her chair, she thought, and felt the small particular accuracy of the possessive, and looked at the parchment, which was still there, undisturbed. "There has to be more of it," she said. "One page isn't 43 visits." He sat across from her. She watched him look at the table's surface with the slightly unfocused quality of someone listening to a frequency just below speech. He reached under the table's edge on his side and found, without searching, a small brass catch she hadn't noticed. He pressed it. A shallow drawer slid open. Inside, a stack of parchment, perhaps 30 pages, covered on both sides with their alternating hands. She looked at him. "I knew it was there," he said quietly. "I don't know how." She reached across the table and he extended the stack toward her, and for a moment both their hands were on the pages, her fingers on one edge, his on the other, and neither of them moved for a breath that lasted slightly longer than a breath should. She took the pages. They read in silence for 20 minutes. The record of 43 conversations was not a narrative, but it was a portrait, assembled from fragments the way a mosaic assembles from fragments, the individual pieces insufficient, the whole devastating in its clarity. They had talked about the war, about guilt, about what came next. They had argued. She could see the arguments in the compressed sharpness of her handwriting, in the wider spacing of his that suggested he'd been pressing the quill harder than usual. They had made each other laugh, apparently on at least 6 occasions, marked by a loosening in both scripts that she found she could feel as well as read. And beneath all of it, like a bass note sustained under a melody, was the other thing. It was not stated directly, not on the early pages. It was present the way pressure is present in a room before a storm, a quality of the atmosphere, a waiting. But page by page, visit by visit, it gathered. It named itself in increments, in the care with which his handwriting addressed hers, in the precision with which she responded to things he hadn't quite said, in the increasing length of the gaps between question and answer that suggested she knew this. She could read silences in text the way she read subtext in speech, that the gaps were not pauses for thought, but pauses for other things. On the 31st page, his hand had written, "I don't know what to do with this," and hers, below it, "Neither do I," and his, after a gap, "That might be the most honest thing either of us has said in 6 years." Hermione set the page down. She could feel him watching her from across the table with the careful attention he gave things he considered important enough to watch carefully. She did not look up immediately. She needed a moment inside her own face before she offered it to him. "We knew," she said. Then, "We knew what the binding was made from." "Yes. And we didn't. We came back here 43 times, and we talked around it and toward it, and we never— No, he said. We never. She looked up. He was leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table, hands loosely linked. A posture she'd rarely seen him adopt, which made it feel strangely intimate, the abandonment of the habitual straightness. His expression was the one she thought of as his honest face. Not unguarded exactly, never quite unguarded, but with the guard present and visible and acknowledged rather than concealed. "Why didn't we?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that I was afraid that saying it would make it something that could be refused." The precision of that. She felt it move through her chest the way very exact things move. Not warmly, but truly, which was better. "And if it were refused," she said, "then whatever we'd built in 43 visits would have a ceiling on it, would become fixed, a thing with a defined limit." He looked at the parchment between them. "Whereas, if I didn't say it, it could keep becoming something." "Yes." She looked at his linked hands on the table. The knuckles of his right hand had a scar she'd noticed before, pale and diagonal, the scar of something that had required stitches or a significant healing charm. She had never asked about it. She was aware of not asking about it now. "And then we died," she said, evenly as she could. His hands stilled. "Technically," he said. "Not technically. The magic required 2 lives offered as surety. We offered them." She paused. "Something brought us back. Something kept us here. But the identity erosion, colleagues not seeing us, the time fractures, the way the ministry moves around us without quite including us. That's the binding. That's what a spell does when it's held past its natural term. It keeps the anchors suspended, and suspension costs something," he said. "Yes. We're paying for it in increments, in specificity, in the gradual disappearance of—" She stopped. She pressed her hand flat against the table. "I looked in the mirror this morning, and it took me 4 seconds to fully recognize myself." She said it without drama, which was the only way she could say it. "That has never happened to me before." His jaw moved. She had catalogued his jaw's involuntary movements over months of careful, not quite observation. And this one, the tight, brief clench and release, meant that something had found its way past the defensive layer, and he was managing the impact. 2 seconds, he said. "For me, this morning." She exhaled slowly. "We're running out of time. Then we need to release the binding. Which means saying the thing we spent 43 visits not saying." He looked at her across the table, across the parchment record of everything they'd been circling, across the candlelight that burned with its inexplicable certainty in the room's still air. "There is a particular irony," he said, with the dry precision he deployed when emotion required some structural management, "in spending an entire war and its aftermath failing to say a thing, only to discover that the saying of it is the only way to remain alive." "We're not alive," she said. "Not fully. Not yet." "No." His eyes held hers. "Not yet." The warmth in the room had increased imperceptibly since their arrival. Or perhaps she'd only now become conscious of it, the way you become conscious of a sound that has been present all along once the ambient noise drops below it. The candle burned. The tallies on the eastern wall held their 43 counted days. The drawer stood open with its 30 pages of record, its portrait of 2 people learning to trust each other with the most inconvenient and least manageable thing. "I want to tell you something," Draco said. His voice had dropped to the register of things said without the rehearsal layer. Not as part of the binding, not as a mechanism, just— He paused. "Just because it's true, and because you should have heard it then, and you didn't." She waited. She was very good at waiting when the alternative was speaking too soon and for closing something that needed space to arrive in its own shape. "In that corridor," he said, "when I stepped in front of you, I told you not to make it more than it was." His thumb moved along the table's edge. It was considerably more than it was. The room was entirely quiet around those words. Hermione felt something shift in her chest, not break, not dissolve, but move, the way a thing moves when it's been held in a fixed position for a very long time and is finally, incrementally, allowed to settle into its actual weight and actual shape. "I know," she said softly. "I thought you might." A pause. "You're very difficult to dissemble to. You have been since the 3rd year." Something that was almost a smile crossed her face before she could arrange her expression around it. "You spent considerable effort." "Extraordinary effort," he agreed. "Almost none of it successful." She looked at him, at the careful, particular, morally complicated person across the table with his honest face and his scar and his 43 tallies on the wall and the weight of everything he'd done and hadn't done and done anyway, carried not dramatically, but in the specific quietness of a person who has decided that quietness is the only dignified vehicle for that particular cargo. "Tomorrow," she said, "we say it properly, in this room, both of us." Something passed through his expression. Relief was part of it, she thought, but relief was too simple a word for the whole of it. "Together," he said. "Together," she confirmed. She gathered the pages back into their stack with hands that were entirely steady, though steadiness required something of her. She slid the stack back into the drawer. He closed the brass catch with a soft, definitive click. They sat for a moment longer in the candle-lit room, not speaking, not needing to, the silence between them having evolved over months into a medium that carried content, that communicated without the imprecision of language and the vulnerability of direct speech. Then she rose, and he rose, and they walked together out of the room and into the corridor, where the torches burned amber, and the ministry moved around them like water around 2 stones that have been in the riverbed long enough to become part of the landscape. Behind them, the door remained visible. It had stopped hiding. There was a particular quality to the ministry at midnight that Hermione had never intended to know this well. She had stayed late before, many times across many years of urgency and overwork. But those late nights had always carried the purposeful exhaustion of someone racing a deadline. The building itself still populated enough to feel inhabited. The cleaners moving through the lower floors, the occasional aura pulling a night shift, the structural hum of an institution that never fully slept. This was different. This was the ministry at the hour when even its residual occupation ceased, when the last footsteps had echoed out of the atrium and the lifts had stilled and the torches had shifted into their lowest sustainable burn, and the building was left to be what it actually was beneath its daily function. Very old, very large, and full of the compressed memory of everything that had ever happened inside it. She had not planned to be here. She had gone home, had stood in her kitchen making tea with the deliberate normalcy of someone trying to convince herself that the ordinary world still applied, and had stood there for perhaps 20 minutes before accepting that sleep was not an available option, and that the place her mind was returning to with the insistence of water finding its level was the 4th floor. She had not expected him to be there. He was sitting on the floor of the corridor outside the sealed room's door, the door that was sealed no longer, that stood slightly ajar with a thread of candlelight finding its way through the gap. He sat with his back against the wall opposite, long legs extended, robes slightly disordered, his head tipped back against the stone, and his eyes closed in the manner of someone not sleeping, but resting inside their own darkness for a while. She stopped walking. He opened his eyes. They looked at each other across the corridor in the minimal torchlight, and neither of them performed surprise or asked what the other was doing there. The absence of that performance felt, in itself, like a form of intimacy, the skipping of a social layer that had become unnecessary. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Neither could I." He looked at her with the directness that midnight permitted, the hour having dissolved the professional distance that daylight maintained. "How long have you been back?" "I went home first." "So did I." A pause. "Approximately 90 minutes. She crossed the corridor and sat beside him against the wall, not at a considered professional distance, but simply at the distance that felt proportionate, which was close. The stone was cold through her robes, and the floor was uneven in the particular way the floor in this section of the corridor had always been, the specific unevenness her feet had learned to anticipate. They sat in silence for a moment. The candlelight from the room's open door moved faintly across the opposite wall, animated by some draught too subtle to feel, casting a light that was warm and unsteady, and that made the corridor feel less like an institutional space and more like something older, something that had existed before the ministry had built itself around it. "I've been thinking about the binding," she said. "I assumed. Not the mechanism of it, not the release." She paused, pressing her shoulder blades back against the stone, feeling the solid, specific reality of it. The fact that it worked at all. He was quiet beside her, listening with the quality of attention he gave things he considered worth attending to, full, unperformed, with none of the ambient distraction that characterized lesser listening. "The dual anchor theory," she continued, "requires the two casters to be in. The term the literature uses is resonance. It doesn't mean agreement or similarity or even mutual regard. Resonance, in this context, means something more specific. It means that the fundamental frequency of one person's essential self is compatible with the fundamental frequency of the others, not identical." She paused. "Complementary, in the way that two different notes are complementary, distinct, individually coherent, but producing something neither could produce alone when sounded together." She felt him shift slightly beside her, not away, a fractional movement toward, so small it might have been the settling of old stone beneath them. "And the fact that it worked," he said, "means we were in resonance." "Had been," she said carefully, "for long enough that the magic could find it and use it under pressure. Resonance isn't instantaneous. It's..." She searched for the right word, the precise one. Accrued. The word sat between them. Accrued. The slow accumulation of something that had been building across years of antagonism and proximity, and the specific friction of two people whose minds were sharp enough to genuinely engage with each other, even when, perhaps especially when, the engagement was hostile. "Third year," he said. She turned her head. He was looking at the opposite wall, at the candlelight's movement there. "When did it start, for you?" he said. Not a question exactly, the form of a question being used to offer a statement. She considered it honestly, because honesty was what the room and the hour and the accumulated weight of everything required. "I think, not consciously, not in any way I'd have named then. I think it was the Buckbeak case, not because of the outcome." She paused. "Because you argued the way you argued, with complete certainty that the world was arranged according to your understanding of it, and complete blindness to the ways it wasn't. And I found that—" She stopped. "Infuriating," he supplied. "Yes, but infuriating in the specific way that things are infuriating when they matter. Indifference isn't infuriating. Irrelevance isn't infuriating." She looked at the candlelight moving on the wall. "You were never irrelevant." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality it carried at its most undefended, lower, slightly rougher, stripped of the precision he used as armature. "For me, it was the time turner." She blinked. "I never told anyone about the time turner." "No, but I knew you had one." A pause. "I spent considerable time working out how you were attending double and triple periods. The conclusion was either a time turner or something I couldn't account for. And I couldn't account for very little regarding you, which—" A brief, dry exhalation that wasn't quite a laugh. "Which was its own form of maddening." She felt the warmth of it, not the story exactly, but the image it carried. A younger version of him, sharp and defended and furious at the world, spending his attention on the puzzle of her. The attention itself, its constancy. "We've been in each other's peripheral vision for a very long time," she said. "Peripheral," he said. "Yes, that's the polite word for it." She smiled before she could decide not to. She felt him feel it, not see it. They were both looking at the wall, but feel the change in her, the slight shift of it. And something in his posture responded with a warmth so quiet it was almost nothing, only a degree of tension released from the line of his arm against hers. Their arms were touching. They had been touching for some time, she realized, without either of them having marked the moment it began. Sleeve against sleeve, not quite skin, but the warmth of him conducting through the fabric with a gentleness that felt entirely unlike accident. She did not move away, neither did he. "I've been thinking about something else," he said. His voice was careful in the particular way it was careful when he was approaching something that required precision. "The identity erosion, the mirror this morning. Yes. I've been considering what it means, specifically, not the magical mechanism, but the experiential content." He paused. "When you looked in the mirror and it took 4 seconds, what was missing?" She thought about it honestly. Not features, not the surface. It was more contextual, as though the reflection were accurate, but the accumulated associations weren't there. The reasons the face meant what it meant. She paused. The history attached to it. Yes. Something in his voice. That's what I thought too. "It's the binding consuming us," she said. We talked about this. We talked about the mechanism. I'm talking about the content. He turned his head and looked at her directly, and in the low light his eyes were darker than their usual grey, the pupils wide, the iris barely distinguishable from them. The history that's going, the associations that are thinning. I've been noticing which ones go first. She looked at him. And? The impersonal ones go first, he said. Ministry procedures, the names of colleagues I rarely interact with, the layout of floors I don't use. A pause. The things that remain sharpest are... He stopped, began again. You are the sharpest thing in my field of vision. Every memory that involves you is perfectly intact, more than intact, more vivid than it was. His eyes held hers with an unflinching steadiness that cost him something. She could see the cost of it, and he paid it anyway. That seems relevant. She held his gaze. The candlelight moved between them, breathing. The same is true for me, she said quietly. The corridor held the statement with the gravity of a room that has been the site of important things and knows how to receive them. Which means, she said, that whatever the binding is consuming, it isn't consuming this. No, he said, it isn't. They were very close. Had been close for the duration of the conversation, the proximity having arrived so gradually that there had been no moment of decision, only the slow, inevitable arithmetic of two people gravitating across a shared distance until the distance is no longer the operative fact. She was aware of his shoulder against hers, his arm, the line of his jaw in the candlelight, the angle of it, the scar on his hand visible where his sleeve had ridden up slightly. That pale diagonal line she'd never asked about and was aware, acutely, of not asking about now. She asked about it. The scar, she said, on your right hand. He looked down at it. For a moment she thought he would redirect, give her the smooth deflection he was capable of. Instead, he said, the night of the 6th year, the bathroom. A pause. Myself. The weight of those 3 words, the specificity of them. She reached across and touched the scar with 2 fingers. Not a gesture of healing, not clinical, nothing she could have categorized under professional or practical. Simply contact. Her fingertips on the pale diagonal line on the back of his hand, feeling the slightly different texture of it, the specific reality of a history written on skin. His hand did not move. He looked at the point of contact with an expression she had no single word for, but which contained, she thought, something very close to the feeling of being seen completely, and finding that one has not, after all, dissolved under it. I'm sorry, she said, not for touching the scar, for what the scar represented, for the year in which it had been made, for the distance she had maintained that year, and before it, and the ways in which that distance had been composed of more than justifiable grievance. Don't, he said softly. We're past apology. What are we past it into? He turned his hand over slowly beneath her touch, a deliberate movement, unhurried, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, until his palm was facing upward and her fingers rested in it. He did not close his hand. He simply held it open, her fingers in his, the contact maintained with a gentleness that felt enormous in proportion to its size. I think, he said, we're past it into this. The candle in the room burned on. The ministry was entirely silent around them, vast and sleeping, all its daily performances suspended, leaving only the stone and the dark and the warm specific fact of his open hand and her fingers in it. Two people who had been in each other's peripheral vision for so long that the centre had, somewhere in the long accumulation of years and proximity and 43 tallies on a wall, quietly rearranged itself. She leaned her head back against the stone and did not remove her fingers from his palm. He leaned his head back beside hers. They sat like that in the breathing candlelight, not speaking, not needing to, existing together in the room the night had made of the corridor, until the first distant sounds of the ministry's early morning staff filtered up from the floors below, and the building began once more to wake. She noticed it first in the parchment. Wednesday morning, 3 days after the corridor, after his open hand and her fingers in it, and the long candle-lit silence that had said more than either of them had managed in months of careful speech. She was reviewing the Flint mediation notes. The Thursday session had been postponed, rescheduled, postponed again, the file acquiring the particular thickness of a case that everyone involved had decided to feel ambivalent about. And she reached for the notation she had made on the previous Friday, a careful summary of the Flint family's primary grievances in her compressed, precise hand. The notation was there. The handwriting was hers. She could not read it, not because the ink had faded or the parchment been damaged. The letters were clear, the formation correct, the words technically legible, but the meaning refused to arrive. She read the same sentence 4 times, with the specific sensation of watching words perform their shapes without producing their content, like hearing a language you once spoke fluently and finding it has become, overnight, merely sound. She set the parchment down. She pressed both hands flat on the desk and breathed with deliberate evenness, and looked at the wall above her shelves where she had pinned, in the first week, a small map of the ministry's 4th floor with her own annotations. The map was there. The annotations were in her hand. She could identify the marks as hers and read none of them. The erasure was accelerating. She had known it would. She had said as much, "We're running out of time," and had understood it intellectually with the part of her mind that processed information as information, cleanly, without the contaminating weight of what the information meant. But intellectual understanding and the experience of sitting at your desk, watching your own handwriting become foreign, were not the same category of thing, and she had made the error of treating them as equivalent. She looked at Draco's desk. He was not there. He had been there at 8. She had registered his arrival, the atmospheric shift of him entering the room, had nodded without looking up from a document she could apparently no longer read, and had left at some point in the intervening hour without her noticing, which itself was remarkable. She had become so attuned to his movements in shared space that his absence should have registered immediately, the way a sound cessation registers more sharply than its continuation. She was losing her attunement. The thought moved through her chest like cold water finding a low point. She stood and gathered her notes, which were increasingly decorative rather than functional, and went to find him. He was in the records room. She found him by the shelves on the north wall, standing very still with an open file box in his hands and an expression on his face that she read before he heard her, before he had the opportunity to arrange his surface. and what she read there made her throat tighten with a precise, located grief. He was looking at the file box's label with the same quality of non-comprehension she had just experienced at her desk. His lips moved slightly, the involuntary movement of someone reading and rereading, trying to force meaning from shapes that had stopped yielding it. "Draco," she said. He looked up. The expression cleared, not into composure exactly, but into the specific steadiness of someone who has decided that steadiness is the appropriate response to crisis, regardless of the cost. "The archival system," he said. "I was cross-referencing the ward records from May 2nd, and I found I couldn't." He stopped, set the file box down on the nearest shelf with a care that was itself a form of control. The labels stopped making sense approximately 20 minutes ago. "My notes," she said. "Same." He looked at her directly. "How much?" "Everything I wrote before this morning. Gone. Or not gone. Present but inaccessible. The form without the content." She paused. "My own annotations on the ministry map." Something moved through his face. "I looked in the mirror before I left the house this morning," he said. 7 seconds. She heard the number and held it. 7 seconds before the reflection resolved into a recognizable self. The progression from 2 to 7 in 3 days was not a gentle gradient. "We have to go to the room," she said. "Today. Now." "I know. We agreed tomorrow, but I know, Granger." He said it with a quiet urgency that had nothing sharp in it, only the pressure of someone who had also been calculating the rate of loss and reaching the same conclusions. "I've been thinking about it since 6 this morning." "The binding releases when we say it," she said. "When we name what the magic was made from. We established this. We established the theory. There's a difference between the theory and..." He stopped. He picked up the file box again, registered it as unreadable, set it down. The gesture had the helpless quality of reaching for a tool that has stopped working. Between the theory and the actual moment of saying it. She crossed the records room and came to stand in front of him. Not at desk distance, not at the professional remove their daily space maintained, but close. The distance the corridor had established, the distance of his open hand and her fingers in it. "Are you frightened?" she asked. He looked down at her. The records room was dim, the single torch not quite reaching the north wall where they stood, his face in partial shadow that made his expression harder to read, but no less present. "Of what specifically?" he said. "There are several available options." "Of saying it and having the binding release and not knowing what comes after." A pause. "Yes," he said. "That one." She nodded. "So am I." She held his gaze steadily. "But I'm more frightened of looking in the mirror in 4 days and not recognizing myself at all." He was quiet for a moment. His hand at his side moved slightly. The fingers of his right hand, where the scar ran pale and diagonal. Not reaching. Simply moving, as though the hand remembered something the rest of him was still deciding. "And after," he said, very carefully. "When the binding releases, whatever we said in that room, whatever becomes true in the saying of it." He paused. "That doesn't dissolve with the spell." "No," she said. "It doesn't. It remains. It remains." He looked at her for a long moment with the honest face, the unguarded one, the one she had learned to identify and to hold carefully when it appeared, knowing it cost him something he didn't give widely. Good, he said quietly. The room received them differently now. She felt it as they crossed the threshold. Not unwelcoming, not foreboding. Something more like the atmosphere of a place that has been anticipating a specific moment and has arranged itself accordingly. The candle was already lit. The chairs were pulled to their familiar angle. The parchment, their first recorded conversation, lay on the table's center as though placed there. She sat. He sat. The candlelight was very steady. "There are things I need to say before we say the thing," he said. His voice was the low, careful register. "Context, not qualifications. I'm not building an escape route. Just context." "All right," she said. He looked at the candle rather than at her. A rare avoidance, meaningful because of its rarity. "I was not a good person during the years you knew me in school. I want to say that without the apparatus of explanation, because explanation tends to become justification if you're not rigorous, and I'm not certain I can be rigorous about my own history." He paused. "I caused harm, specific harm, to you among others." Another pause, the weight of it. "I've spent 3 years since the war trying to determine what appropriate acknowledgement of that looks like, and I haven't finished determining it, and I'm not sure I will." He looked up from the candle to her face. "But I needed you to know that I know, before anything else." She held his gaze across the table. "I know you know," she said gently. "I've watched you know it for 3 months." He absorbed this, the specific way he absorbed difficult kindnesses, without deflecting it, without performing gratitude, simply taking it in with the still acceptance of someone learning, slowly, to receive what they've decided they may not deserve. "And I need to say," she continued, "that my hands are not clean either. Different stains. But I have spent my own years examining what I did and didn't do, and the space between, and I understand, more than I did at school, considerably more, that moral simplicity is a position sustained only by insufficient examination." She paused. "I examined. You were never the simple villain the narrative required." Something shifted in his expression. A depth charge, slow and invisible, moving through still water. "You're the only person," he said, "who has said that without using it as an excuse for me." "It's not an excuse," she said. "It's an accurate assessment." He nodded once. Then he looked at the parchment between them, their first recorded conversation, the alternating hands, the call and response, the impossible intimacy of "I'll remember everything" written in his careful, slanted script. "The binding," he said. "Yes." He exhaled slowly. She watched his hands settle on the table, not linked this time, but open, palms down, the scar visible on his right. Grounded, braced for honesty. "What I offered in that corridor," he said. "What was true enough for the magic to use. I've had 3 months to approach this, and I've arrived at it from every available angle, and there is only one thing it could have been." His eyes held hers. "It was the fact that losing you was not something I was willing to be the world that contained. That moment, in the corridor, watching that hex assemble, I experienced the absolute incompatibility of your absence with any future I could inhabit." He paused. "Not heroism, not calculation. A fact. The way mass is a fact. The way gravity is a fact." The room was entirely still. She felt the words land in her with the precision of something finding its exact location. Not falling, but arriving, as though the space for them had always existed, and had simply been waiting to be occupied. "The magic found that," she said. "Yes." She pressed her hands flat on the table, feeling the grain of it, grounding herself in the texture of something solid before she spoke into the air, which would hold what she said and not return it. "In the corridor," she said. "I was turning. I knew I was too slow. And in the instant between knowing and the hex arriving, what I felt was not fear." She paused. "It was a window closing, a specific window, the particular future in which I had not yet determined what you were to me, but in which the determining remained possible." Her voice was very steady. She was paying for the steadiness, but she was paying it willingly. "The binding found that. The refusal to let that window close before I'd had the chance to look properly through it." He was very still across from her. "You were already something," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "I was already something, and I hadn't named it, and I was not prepared for the naming to be foreclosed." The candle flame moved, a single, small movement, as though the room had inhaled. "Hermione!" Her name in his mouth with that particular quality, all of it. Not the professional version, not the careful version, the full weight of it. "I know," she said softly. "I need to say it. Not for the binding." His grey eyes in the candlelight, holding hers without the guard, without the surface, with the entirety of 3 years of quiet, accumulating truth. "For me, because it should have been said in this room, on the 32nd visit or the 33rd, and wasn't, and we lost the chance, and I am not going to lose it again." She did not speak. She gave him the silence like an open hand. "I love you," he said. "That is what was true. That is what the magic found. That is what has been surviving everything that the binding has been consuming, intact and entirely clear, which, given my general talent for self-deception, I find I can no longer argue with." A pause. "I love you, and I have in various incomplete and unexamined forms, since before I had the vocabulary for what I was feeling or the character to do anything useful with it." The room held the words. The candle burned straight and unwavering. Hermione felt the binding shift. Not break, not yet, but move, the way ice moves in the first moment of thaw, a deep structural settling, the beginning of a release that had been waiting for exactly these words in exactly this room from exactly these two people. Her own truth, she understood, was the other half of it. The release required both anchors. She leaned forward slightly across the table, toward him and the candle and the 30 pages of what they'd been to each other, and she opened her mouth to speak the other half. The candle flame, as though it had been counting down to this moment since the 2nd of May 3 years ago, burned suddenly and brilliantly brighter, not guttering, not alarming, but luminous, throwing the room into warm gold, and then held there, waiting as the words gathered in her throat and prepared, at last, to become real. She said it without preamble. Not because she lacked the capacity for preamble. She was, by nature and by years of academic formation, a person who built careful scaffolding around significant statements, who understood that context was not decoration, but load-bearing structure. But in this moment, in this room, with the candle burning its brilliant, impossible gold, and his words still present in the air between them, like something solid, she understood that preamble would be a form of cowardice, a way of making the approach to the truth longer than the truth itself required. "I love you," she said, simply, directly, with the full weight of herself behind it, unqualified, unhedged, the way she had always privately believed significant things deserved to be said, not dressed in protective irony or preceded by so many qualifications that the statement arrived already weakened. I have loved you in some form since before I was willing to examine what that form was, and in a clearer form since the night in this room when you wrote, "I'll remember everything," and meant it absolutely. And I read it absolutely, and chose not to name what I felt, because naming it meant it was real, and real things can be lost. She paused. I chose the risk of loss over the certainty of it, and I chose wrongly, and I am choosing differently now. Across the table, Draco was very still. Not the stillness of composure, not the managed, deliberate stillness he deployed as a professional surface. This was something prior to composure, something beneath it, the stillness of a person in the moment when the thing they have most wanted and most feared to receive has arrived simultaneously, and the self requires a moment to determine which of those responses to lead with. Then, something in him released. She saw it, not dramatically, not with any external flourish. It was visible only in the degree to which his shoulders descended, in the almost imperceptible softening of the line of his jaw, in the way his hands, flat on the table, turned slightly inward, the fingers curling once and then settling. He breathed, and then the binding moved. She felt it as a physical fact, not painful, not violent, but unmistakable. A pressure she had not known she was carrying, distributed through her chest and shoulders and the base of her throat, shifting and beginning to lift. The way the atmosphere changes in the moment, a window is opened into a room that has been sealed for a long time. Not a dramatic change, but a fundamental one. The air altered at its most basic quality. The candlelight in the room changed with it. The brilliant gold it had achieved in the moment before she spoke deepened further, became warmer, less like fire and more like... She searched for the right comparison and found it in memory, the specific quality of late autumn afternoon light through old glass, amber and generous, and entirely without urgency, the tallies on the eastern wall. She watched them in the changed light, and saw, for the first time, not 43 marks of counted days, but 43 moments of return. 43 times, two people had chosen to come back to this room rather than away from it, which was its own kind of record, its own kind of declaration. "It's releasing," she said. "Yes." His voice was different. She could hear the difference, the same quality she'd heard in the corridor minutes after the battle, stripped of the translating layer. "I can feel it." "Does it?" She paused. "Is it?" "No," he said, understanding her before she finished, which he did with an increasing frequency that she had stopped trying to categorize as coincidence. "It doesn't hurt." She nodded. She pressed her hands flat on the table one more time, feeling the grain of old wood, the specific texture of this particular surface that had held their notes and their silences, and 30 pages of everything they'd been circling. She wanted to remember the feeling of it. She was aware of wanting to remember it, which was itself a recovery. 3 days ago, she had been losing the capacity to access memory, and now the memories were not only present, but vivid, arriving with the specific sharpness of things that have been briefly threatened and are now, unexpectedly, safe. "What happens," he said, "when it finishes?" not a question. The form of a question used to open a space. "I don't know exactly," she said honestly. "The theory doesn't account for a willing release with both anchors present. It assumes the binding dissolves when the term is complete, when whatever condition was set has been fulfilled." She paused. "We've fulfilled the condition. We've said the thing that was true. We've said it, and it's been received." She looked at him. Both directions. His eyes held hers across the shifting, warming light. "Then we'll find out together what comes after." "Yes," she said, "we will." The release, when it completed, was quiet. She had expected, some part of her had expected, shaped by years of dramatic, magical events, by the particular education of living through a war, something commensurate with the weight of what was being resolved. Light, sound, the physical grammar of significant magic announcing itself. What happened instead was a stillness so complete that it took her several seconds to understand it as the presence of something rather than the absence of it. The pressure was gone. The distributed weight she had not consciously known she was carrying had lifted entirely, leaving behind a lightness that was not emptiness, but its precise opposite. The lightness of a thing working as it was designed to work, without friction, without resistance. She breathed, and the breath reached further than it had in months. She looked at her hands. She looked at the room. She looked at Draco, who was looking back at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was notable because she had by now catalogued most of his expressions with a thoroughness that was either impressive or alarming, depending on one's perspective. This expression was new, or not new, she realized, but revealed, as though something that had always been present in him had been operating behind a scrim that had now, quietly, been removed. He looked. Lighter was the word. Not younger, not uncomplicated, but lighter in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally, in the right place with the right person, been permitted to set it down. "Are you still here?" she asked, lightly, but not entirely lightly. "I'm here," he said. Then, with a faint and genuine quality of wonder, "Entirely." She stood from the table. He stood too, on his side, and they looked at each other across the candle holder and the parchment and the 30 pages of everything that had led to this room, this moment, the released binding, and the words that had released it. She came around the table. She was not certain afterward which of them moved first. The question seemed, in retrospect, beside the point. One of those causal puzzles that dissolves under examination because the movement was mutual in a way that preceded any individual decision. The way two things in resonance move toward each other, not from instruction, but from nature. She stood in front of him. The room's warm light was all around them. His face was very close. She reached up and touched his jaw with her fingertips. Not the scar on his hand this time, not the careful peripheral contact of sleeve against sleeve, but his face, the specific angle of his jaw, the particular reality of him at this precise distance. She felt the slight tension of his muscles under her touch, and then the release of it. His hand came up to her face in return, not urgent, not claiming, with the specific gentleness of someone touching something they understand to be rare. The flat of his palm against her cheek, his thumb at her temple, his fingers in her hair, careful as a person handling the only remaining page of an irreplaceable text. "Hermione," he said. Just that. Her name with its full weight. "I know," she said. He kissed her. Or she kissed him. The question was the same question, with the same answer, because it happened between them rather than from either of them. The way the binding had happened, and the resonance had happened, and the 43 tallies had happened, not by individual decision, but by the accumulated inevitability of two people in the same room, enough times that the room itself eventually made the argument. It was not a tentative kiss. Neither of them was, fundamentally, a tentative person, and 3 years and a binding, and 43 visits and 2 declared truths had removed whatever remained of the architecture of caution. It was thorough and warm, and carried the specific quality of something long overdue, arriving not late, but exactly on time, which are not the same thing. She felt the warmth of him completely, the solidity of him, the specific reality of his hands in her hair and at her jaw, the slight unevenness of his breathing against her mouth, the way he kissed her with the same quality of absolute attention he gave to everything he considered worth attending to, which was the most Draco Malfoy thing about the kiss, and the thing she would remember with the greatest clarity long afterward. When they parted, it was slowly, and only by degrees, and not entirely. His forehead came to rest against hers. His hands remained where they were. She could feel his breath, steadying, and her own, doing the same, and the room around them warm and still, and holding them with the particular quality it had always had. The room that had been waiting, that had kept their records, that had held the candle lit without an obvious source since the moment they first entered it together. "We're alive," she said softly, into the small space between them. "Entirely," he said again. She felt it as truth in a way she had not been able to feel it for 3 months. The specific, unambiguous reality of being present, of the edges of herself meeting the world and holding. She was Hermione Granger, completely. The annotations on the ministry map would make sense in the morning. The Flint mediation notes would be legible. Her face in the mirror would resolve in less than a second. And Draco Malfoy was holding her face in his hands in a sealed room that was sealed no longer, and the candle was burning its warm amber gold. And outside the door, the ministry's 4th-floor corridor waited with its even torches and its familiar uneven floor. And beyond it, the world continued, complicated and demanding, and full of the ordinary, extraordinary difficulty of being alive and specific and real. "What do we do now?" he asked. His voice was quiet against her temple. "Now," she said, "we go back to work." She felt the laugh move through him before she heard it. A low, genuine sound, unguarded in the way very few things about him were unguarded, beautiful in proportion to its rarity. "The Flint mediation," he said. "Thursday," she confirmed. "Peregrine Flint will throw another inkwell. Probably, and will be there to manage it." She drew back slightly to look at him, at the honest face, the lighter face, the face she had been cataloguing for months, and could now look at directly without the elaborate architecture of looking away. Together. He looked at her with the grey eyes that held in this light everything they had been and done and said and not said, and finally, irrevocably said. His thumb moved once along her cheekbone, a small, deliberate movement, not a caress exactly, but a notation, a mark of something present. Together, he agreed. The Hogwarts Memorial was not somewhere Hermione visited often. It existed on the grounds near the lake, a low stone wall on which names had been added in the years since the battle. Added by hand, by wand, by spells of varying elegance and care, the names accumulating with the particular democracy of loss, which does not distinguish between the celebrated and the unremembered, but only between the absent and the present. She had been once, in the first year after the war, and had found it too much for extended examination and had not returned. She returned now, on a Saturday in early December, with Draco beside her, and the lake behind them grey and still under a sky the colour of old pewter. The grounds were quiet. The castle above them breathed its ancient specific breath, wood smoke and cold stone, and the faint trace of 1,000 years of magic, ambient and accumulated, the way some places accumulate what has happened in them until the happening is structural. She found the names without difficulty, which surprised her. She had expected to search, to read along the wall until she arrived at the right place. Instead, she moved directly, her feet knowing the route with the confidence of something that had been walked before, and stopped at the section near the wall's eastern end. 2 names, hers and his, side by side, carved in the specific style of names added not at the wall's initial construction, but later by someone, she had no way to know who had thought they belonged there. She stood and looked at them for a long moment. Draco stood beside her. His hand found hers at their sides, not dramatically, not with the weight of significant gesture, but with the simple ease of something that had become natural. His fingers through hers, her hand in his. "We're on the memorial," she said. "Yes." "We're also standing here reading it." "Yes." A pause. Magic has never been particularly troubled by logical consistency. She looked at her name in the stone and felt the specific quality of it. Not grief, not fear, but something closer to recognition. The shape of what had happened, fully visible. They had been here, in the most permanent sense available to the war's record. They had offered their lives in a corridor on the 2nd of May, and the world had recorded the offering. And then, through the improbable grace of a binding that loved them better than they had loved themselves, given them back. Given them back to each other, which was, she understood now, the finer gift. "It's strange," she said, "to feel grateful for it." "For which part specifically?" he said. "There are several available options." She turned and looked at him. At the grey of his eyes in the winter light, at the particular face she had been studying for 3 years, and would, she understood, with the clarity of something finally, cleanly known, continue studying for a considerable time beyond that. At the slight curve at his mouth, that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, the expression he allowed himself when something had moved him, and he was willing for her, specifically, to see it. "For all of it," she said. His hand tightened around hers by a single degree. Above them, the castle's windows caught what light the December sky offered, and returned it, amber warm, the way old glass returns light. Imperfectly, individually, with the specific character of its own particular age and composition. Below them, the lake held the skies grey and said nothing. Around them, the grounds were quiet, with the quiet of a place that had held enormous things and was now, on this ordinary December morning, simply itself. She leaned into him slightly. His arm came around her, unhurried, entirely certain. They stood at the wall with their names in the stone and their hands together, and the future arranged before them in all its complicated, demanding, ordinary and extraordinary reality. The Flint mediation on Thursday, the ministry on Monday, the fourth-floor corridor with its even torches, the room that was sealed no longer, the 30 pages of record in the brass-latched drawer that they would, she thought, keep. Not as evidence, not as proof, simply as the record of how they had found their way to each other, slowly, imperfectly, through antagonism and war, and a binding that had held them suspended between one life and the next, until they were ready to choose the next one. She was ready. Beside her, Draco was warm and present and entirely real. She turned her face up toward the castle, toward the pewter sky, toward the specific amber light of December in Scotland that had no obligation to be beautiful, and was, regardless, beautiful. And she felt herself, completely and without remainder, alive.
When I started writing this story, I had one question. What if two people loved each other but never said it? And what if the silence was literally killing them? Draco and Hermione are not an obvious pair. They fought, they hurt each other, they came from different worlds inside the same world. But that's exactly why their story is interesting. Because love doesn't always start with warmth. Sometimes it starts with friction. With two people who can't ignore each other no matter how hard they try. In this story, they didn't get a second chance. They got something harder. They had to earn it. Inside a sealed room with 43 tallies on a wall, with words they were afraid to say out loud. I believe that the most honest thing we feel are also the hardest to speak. Draco knew this, Hermione knew this, and maybe you know it too. This story is for anyone who has ever loved someone quietly, for too long, from too far away. It's not too late to say the thing that it's true. It was never too late for them, and it's not too late for you. Thank you for listening.